Now, regarding the styling of our components, we still use CSS, but there is nothing too React specific when it comes to that CSS code. In the end, we can just add a new CSS file, and typically, for the CSS code of a given component, you add that file next to the component JavaScript file, and that would be the expense item.css file here. Then you want to write your CSS code in there, but since this is no CSS course, I don't want to bore you with writing a lot of CSS code, and hence you attached find a finished expense item CSS file, which you can simply download and use, or simply download it, open it, and copy the code you find in there into your expense item CSS file. Now, back in expense item.js, we need to do one important thing. We need to make this overall build process aware of that CSS file and tell it that the CSS code in there should be considered and should be injected in the finished application. Because it's not by default browsing all your files and automatically including everything. You explicitly have to tell React, you could say, or that build process, that a certain file should be considered. For expense item.js, we did this with this import in app.js. For expense item CSS, we need to do that inside of expense item.js. There, we simply import /expense item.css, just like that. This simply tells the build process that the CSS file should be considered. Now, inside of that CSS file, I in the end just prepared a bunch of CSS classes which can be added to elements to apply a certain look. And therefore now on this HTML code in expense item, in our component, we need to add these classes. For example, on the wrapping div here. Now there's one special thing here. We don't type class here, as we would do in regular HTML, but instead class name. And this can be strange, but you have to keep in mind that this here is not really HTML. It looks like HTML, but it's this special JSX syntax invented by the React team. And in the end, under the hood, it's still JavaScript code. That's why most attributes are the same, but not all. And here, the class attribute was renamed to class name because class is a reserved word in JavaScript. Technically, it would still work if you would use class here, but you should use class name. Now here on this overall div, which wraps everything, we then add the expense-item class here. On this div, which holds our title and our amount, we add another class name, which is expense-item __. So here we got 2 underscores, description. And then here on that div with the amount, we simply add class name and then expense-item __, price. And if you now save everything, it should look like this, which is definitely nicer. Still not the final look we want, but definitely nicer. By the way, I'm super zoomed in here to make this easier to read, otherwise it would look something like this. And that's definitely also not great, but again, it's not the final look. Again, let me zoom in closer so that we can better see that though. Now that is how easy it is to add styling to your React components though. It's really not too fancy. You have to be aware of the fact that it's class name instead of class, but other than that, it's really just standard CSS code, which then is added to your elements. And in that CSS code, you can use all the selectors you might know. You're not limited to classes, but again, I don't want to turn that into a CSS course, so we'll keep that fairly simple. This import might be the strangest thing in the end, because that is needed to make this entire project aware of that CSS file. And that's how we can style our components.